Imagine standing at the edge of a gray shoreline, scanning the horizon for the first light of morning, and instead, watching the entire ocean disappear behind a wall of foreign masts. It is the autumn of 1274, and the narrow straits around Tsushima have turned into a graveyard before the fighting even starts. What drifts toward you is not simply a fleet. It is a message written in human suffering. Dozens of Korean and Japanese captives dangle from the bows of the warships, their wrists threaded through coarse rope and lashed to the hulls like slaughtered game hung outside a butcher's stall. Women, monks, children barely old enough to walk. Their bodies sway with every wave, forming a living curtain of flesh designed to make your archers hesitate. Every arrow aimed at the ships would land in the chest of someone you swore to protect. This is not warfare. This is psychological annihilation, dressed in timber and sail. For generations, the warrior class of Japan had built an entire civilization around the belief that combat was a ritual. You stepped forward in lacquered plate, announced your family name across the battlefield, and met your equal blade to blade. Honor was not a word. It was the architecture of an empire. But when the first samurai thundered across the wet sand at Komoda Beach, bellowing the names of their grandfathers into the salt air, the Mongol line did not pause to listen. It responded with a coordinated storm of ceramic grenades and arrows dipped in poison that turned the shoreline into a slaughterhouse. Within hours, every rule the defenders had ever known was made meaningless. They carried swords into a world that had already moved beyond swords. They died not just defeated. They died disoriented. The version of this story that survived for 7 centuries is one of the most dangerous lies in military history. You were taught that the samurai regrouped, that divine intervention conjured a sacred typhoon, the Kamikaze, and that Japan was saved by the will of the heavens. None of that is what actually happened. The defenders were shattered. They survived not through courage or strategy, but through a meteorological accident that had nothing to do with destiny. And the myth that grew from that accident became a poison far deadlier than anything the Mongols ever fired. It convinced an entire nation that it could not be conquered. That delusion calcified across centuries until it sent teenagers strapped into cockpits on one-way flights into American carriers, and it only ended when 2 nuclear detonations burned the fantasy to ash. This is the real story of how 20,000 Mongol soldiers dismantled the samurai code on a beach most people have never heard of. Before we walk into the carnage, drop a comment with the city and country you are watching from. Take a second to subscribe and support the channel. You are watching Ancestral, the best dark history channel in the world. 6 years before the shores of Tsushima turned to rot, a sealed parchment crossed the sea and landed in the imperial capital of Kyoto. The year was AD 1268. The letter bore the personal stamp of Kublai Khan, blood heir to the throne of Genghis, ruler of the largest unbroken land empire the world had ever produced. His dominion swallowed everything from the frozen wilderness of Siberia to the borders of Persia, scraping the edges of Eastern Europe. He commanded generals who had deleted entire kingdoms from the map, reduced ancient libraries to charcoal, and diverted whole rivers to flood cities that dared to resist. This letter was not an invitation to trade. It was an ultimatum wrapped in silk language. Kneel and live as subjects beneath the Mongol banner. Refuse and learn what happens when the most efficient killing apparatus in human history turns its attention toward your coastline. The men governing Japan had no framework to process the scale of this threat. They existed on a chain of islands surrounded by violent currents, sealed inside a mythology of divine exceptionalism. The Kamakura shogunate was a military regime forged through internal bloodletting, obsessive honor rituals, and territorial feuds between rival clans. Real authority rested with the regent, Hojo Tokimune. He was 18 years old. A teenager raised inside temple walls, fed a steady diet of monks telling him that Japan was sacred soil, chosen by the gods. He read the demands of the most dangerous man on the planet. He said nothing. He sent no reply. The Hojo clan had not inherited their seat through heavenly appointment. They had carved it out of a century of targeted assassinations, behind closed-door betrayals, and the methodical elimination of anyone who threatened their grip. Paranoia was the family inheritance. Every corridor concealed a potential blade. Every allied lord was a suspected conspirator, waiting for the right moment to strike. When a ruling class spends all of its energy watching its own shadow, it loses the ability to see what is gathering on the horizon. Tokimune devoted his waking hours to managing the fragile allegiances of the southern provinces, completely unaware that every assumption his government operated on was about to be dismantled by a foreign power that did not recognize any of his rules. The Mongols had no interest in negotiating with the Hojo. They intended to turn the seat of the shogunate into open pasture for their cavalry horses. Tokimune ignored the first letter, then the second. Kublai Khan dispatched Korean diplomats across the strait. The shogunate refused them entry into the capital. Seasons passed. The silence did not create safety. It created fury. By AD 1275, later envoys would be seized and marched to the execution grounds at Tatsunokuchi Beach. A blade rose. Heads dropped onto the wet sand. The shogunate believed they were projecting unshakable resolve. What they were actually doing was signing a death sentence for thousands of their own citizens. You do not decapitate the ambassadors of a man who controls a third of the known world and expect the conversation to end. Across the water, the war engine stirred. Kublai Khan turned his full attention to the Korean peninsula. He ordered the conquered Goryeo dynasty to build an invasion fleet large enough to cross the Korea Strait. The demands placed on Korean shoulders were beyond what any reasonable timeline could support. Shipwrights labored under the constant crack of Mongol overseers. They stripped entire mountainsides of timber until the hills stood naked. Workers starved at the docks, their bones pressing against paper-thin skin as they dragged green logs through the mud. They constructed flat-bottomed transports, specifically engineered to navigate the shallow coastal waters of Japan. The build was frantic. The wood had no time to cure. Planks warped before they were nailed into place. But by November of AD 1274, the fleet was afloat, and the order was given to sail. Now, hold in your mind the logistical horror of transporting 20,000 men across open, hostile water. The vessels assembled by Korean forced labor were not built for comfort. They were floating cages of unseasoned timber that groaned and twisted in the salt air. Below deck, conditions were a breeding pit for sickness. Thousands of war horses stood crammed flank to flank in pitch-black holds, standing in pools of their own waste for days on end. When the autumn storms tore across the strait, the ships rolled violently in the swells. Horses shattered their legs against the bulkheads. Soldiers had to butcher the screaming animals in the darkness before the thrashing hooves crushed the men sleeping beside them. The smell of blood, human waste, and rotting feed soaked into every plank. The warriors who staggered onto Japanese sand were not rested troops arriving for a disciplined campaign. They were traumatized survivors of a floating nightmare. The crossing had already stripped them of whatever mercy they might have carried. The sea had hollowed them out and filled the space with rage. 900 ships sat in the dark harbor waters. They carried Mongol cavalry, Chinese infantry, and Korean conscripts bound together under a single flag of conquest. They carried siege specialists who understood the volatile science of black powder. The autumn wind filled the sails. The sky seemed to shrink beneath the sheer mass of the armada. The fleet set course for the island of Tsushima, the geographical doorstep to the Japanese mainland. On the decks, soldiers prepared their instruments of death. They did not carry the tall asymmetric bows favored by the Japanese. They wielded the Mongol composite bow, a compact masterpiece of layered horn, wood, and animal sinew bonded under extreme pressure. It was designed to fire from the saddle, short enough to clear a horse's neck, but powerful enough to punch a shaft clean through solid timber. The men sat cross-legged on the rolling decks, grinding their arrowheads to a needle edge. They coated the steel tips in a thick paste extracted from the roots of the aconite plant, a neurotoxin that turned every arrow into a chemical weapon. This fleet was not crossing the strait to claim territory through any recognizable code of engagement. It was crossing to erase resistance at the biological level. The 4th day of November, AD 1274. A weak sun crept above the fog, clinging to the island of Tsushima. The local governor, So Sukakuni, stood on the cliffs above Sasu Bay and watched the world he understood come to an end. The ocean had vanished. In its place stood an unbroken barrier of timber and iron, stretching from one edge of the horizon to the other. Hundreds of vessels dropped anchor off the beach at Komoda. Shallow draft landing boats detached from the larger ships and ground into the sand. Sukakuni assembled his garrison. He counted 80 mounted warriors, 80 men staring down 20,000 invaders. Within the ancient logic of the samurai, this was not a death sentence. It was the highest possible gift. You ride to the waterline. You announce the history of your bloodline to the enemy. You identify a commander of matching rank. You fight him alone, blade against blade, and the outcome writes your name into eternity. The romance of the moment blinded every man on that cliff to the arithmetic of what waited below. They strapped themselves into their ceremonial armor, the oyoroi, a rigid shell of lacquered leather plates and braided silk cords engineered to deflect a single arrow during a personal duel. It was heavy. It was stiff. It was a costume designed for a theater of war that no longer existed. The 80 riders descended toward the Mongol line. They halted at the edge of the sand. One samurai kicked his horse forward ahead of the rest. He drew his longbow, aimed at the gray sky, and released a single whistling arrow in a high arc over the enemy ranks. This was the kaburaya, the signal arrow, the ancient invitation for an opposing champion to step forward and begin an honorable contest. The Mongol infantry watched the arrow rise and fall. They did not understand the gesture. They did not respond to it. The commanders raised their signal flags. A thunderous roar erupted from the Mongol formation. Massive war drums began pounding a deep, grinding rhythm. Bronze gongs crashed in overlapping waves of metallic shrieking. The noise alone sent the Japanese horses into uncontrollable terror. They reared. They threw their armored riders face first into the packed earth. The wall of sound was itself a weapon, and the samurai had no defense against it. The warriors of the Kamakura period had trained their entire lives in the tense silence of the duel. They listened for the creak of leather, the exhale before a cut. The Mongols obliterated this silence with calculated acoustic violence. The bass frequency of the drums traveled through the sand and up through the legs of the defenders, vibrating inside their chests, forcing their heart rates to spike before a single blade had been drawn. The metallic scream of the gongs buried every shouted order. Commanders could not reach their men. Units could not coordinate. Each samurai became a deaf, isolated figure trapped inside a hurricane of noise, fighting alone in the middle of 1,000 enemies. Then the sky went dark. A coordinated volley of poisoned arrows fell on the scattered defenders like black rain. The silk lacing of the samurai armor could not stop the barrage. Steel points punched through leather and flesh. What followed was a specific biological horror. Aconite does not grant a quick death. The moment the contaminated arrowhead breaks skin, the neurotoxin enters the blood. The first sensation is a strange tingling across the lips and tongue. Then the body temperature plummets without warning. Muscles begin to spasm and lock. Samurai reaching for the handles of their swords found their fingers curling into frozen claws, refusing every command the brain sent. As the poison reaches the cardiac muscle, it scrambles the electrical rhythm of the heart. The chest locks. The lungs try to expand, but the diaphragm has seized. The men dying on Komoda Beach did not fall screaming war cries. They collapsed into the bloody sand, mouths open, eyes wide, drowning in air their bodies could no longer use. Sukakuni fought with the blind fury of a man watching his entire lineage die around him. A Mongol blade found him in the chaos. He went down. 80 men were slaughtered in minutes. There was no poetry in it, no ceremony, no duels, just the cold mechanical efficiency of a professional army removing an obstruction from its path. The defense of Tsushima ceased to exist. The island lay open. Mongol soldiers flooded into the fishing villages scattered through the hills. They did not take captives for negotiation. They rounded up the surviving women, the children, the elderly temple monks. They dragged them down to the shoreline. Soldiers hammered iron spikes directly through the palms of their hands. They fed coarse hemp rope through the bleeding wounds and tied the captives together in long, agonizing chains. They hauled these human garlands over the sides of the warships and left them hanging against the salt-crusted hulls. Seawater hit the exposed nerves. The weight of their own suspended bodies tore the flesh of their hands wider with every swell. The screaming carried across the water for miles. It was a deliberate instrument of psychological warfare. Any Japanese bowman on a neighboring shore who tried to fire on the approaching fleet would have to send his arrows through the dangling bodies of his own people. The ground units swept through the interior. They put fire to every standing structure. They butchered every animal. When a village had been emptied of all life, the soldiers fulfilled their administrative obligation. The Mongol command hierarchy required physical evidence of kills to calculate pay and rations. Severed heads were too heavy to transport back to the fleet, so the soldiers drew their skinning knives. They sliced the left ear or the nose from every corpse they found. They packed the flesh in salt to slow the rot. They tossed the pieces into large wooden collection barrels. The accounting of death was calm, orderly, and total. The island of Tsushima was functionally deleted. The fleet raised anchor. The water behind them was dark with what it carried. They sailed for the next target, the smaller island of Iki. The governor there, Taira Kagetaka, had already seen the black smoke rising from the direction of Tsushima. He sealed himself inside his wooden fortress with 100 defenders. The Mongol landing boats scraped onto the shores of Iki. There was no attempt at sophisticated siege tactics. The attackers swarmed the walls in an overwhelming tide of bodies. Kagetaka ordered his archers to fire into the mass. Arrows struck Mongol wicker shields and bounced. The invaders responded with something no Japanese warrior had ever witnessed in recorded history. The siege engineers stepped to the front of the line. They ignited short fuses on hollow iron shells packed tight with black powder and jagged metal fragments. They lobbed the teppo over the wooden palisades. The bombs struck the inner courtyard. A white flash split the air. The blast wave ruptured the eardrums of every defender within range. Shrapnel ripped through the thin timber walls and shredded human tissue. The Japanese inside the fortress believed the sky itself was breaking apart. The gates blew inward. Mongol soldiers poured through the breach, their curved swords rising and falling in an efficient, rhythmic harvest. Kagetaka understood the end had arrived. He withdrew to the deepest chamber of his burning stronghold. He drew his short blade. He drove it into his own stomach rather than be taken alive. His family burned around him in the collapsing structure. Iki fell within hours. Before the last wall of Iki crumbled, Kagetaka made one final decision. He found a retainer named Sozaburo and ordered him into a narrow fishing boat hidden inside a sea cave along the coast. Sozaburo shoved the vessel into the black water. He rowed with arms that burned and tore. Behind him, his entire world glowed orange and collapsed into the sea. He rowed toward the mainland of Kyushu. He was the only warning an entire nation would receive. The Mongol fleet did not bother to chase him. They did not care if the mainland saw them coming. Surprise was a luxury for armies that needed it. When you carry overwhelming industrialized force, advance notice changes nothing. The message struck the administrative hub of Dazaifu on the coast of Kyushu like a physical blow. Regional commanders dispatched riders on the fastest horses available, racing eastward toward the seat of the shogunate in Kamakura. The gravity of years of silence finally landed on the government. The boy regent Tokimune issued emergency mobilization orders to every clan in the southern provinces. Warlords, who had spent decades bleeding each other over narrow strips of rice land, were now commanded to stand shoulder to shoulder on the same beach. They marched toward Hakata Bay. Hakata was the economic jugular of Kyushu, a wide crescent of pale sand backed by ancient groves of pine. It was the only coastline with enough depth and breadth to receive an invasion force of this magnitude. The samurai arrived and planted their clan banners in the sand. Thousands of warriors set up camp with their retainers and squires, carrying every outdated assumption their culture had given them. They sat in the firelight, oiling their blades, debating the protocol of who would claim the honor of the first kill. They were preparing for a grand ritual of individual combat. They had absolutely no understanding of the mechanized butchery drifting toward them across the dark strait. To grasp the scale of what happened next, you have to understand the fatal defect encoded into the samurai mind of AD 1274. They did not treat warfare as a strategic operation designed to hold ground. They treated it as a legal framework for personal career advancement. The Kamakura system ran on a strict economy of reward. A warrior received land grants only if he could demonstrate that he had personally killed a high-ranking opponent. Proof required witnesses. You needed your peers to watch you ride out, announce your name, and take a head. Collaboration was not just discouraged, it was economically punished. Fighting as a coordinated unit meant splitting the credit, which meant diluting the reward. They were not an army. They were a loose confederation of competing individual killers forced onto the same beach. The Mongol military operated on the precise opposite principle. The individual soldier had zero value. Genghis Khan had engineered a doctrine built on absolute obedience and synchronized movement. They fought in locked formations. If a squad of 10 broke its line, all 10 were put to death. If one man ran, his entire unit was executed. They moved as a single organism with thousands of limbs, directed by the choreography of black and white signal flags, the crash of gongs, and the metronomic pounding of drums. They did not seek personal recognition. They sought the fastest possible annihilation of the opposing force. When these two incompatible philosophies met on the sand of Hakata, the result was not a battle. It was a systematic extermination. The Mongol armada dropped anchor across Hakata Bay. The horizon disappeared behind a forest of masts. The shallow draft assault boats broke away from the main fleet and rowed for shore. The Japanese defenders lined the beach in their polished armor. They watched the boats approach. The samurai kicked their horses into the shallows. They expected the invaders to pause, to send forward their champions, to observe the ritual. They rode into the surf, howling their ancestral names over the roar of the breaking waves. The Mongols did not pause. The instant their boots hit wet sand, the infantry locked into a shield wall. Long spears jutted from the gaps between overlapping panels of wood and boiled leather. The Japanese cavalry hit this solid mass at full gallop. Their curved swords were lethal instruments in a single duel or against unprotected infantry, but against a dense wall of interlocking shields and angled spear points, they were irrelevant. Blades bit into wood and stuck. Spears punched into the exposed bellies of the horses. The animals screamed and collapsed in the surf, pinning their armored riders beneath hundreds of pounds of dying muscle. The crescent shoreline became a killing floor. The soft sand devoured the momentum of every mounted charge. Hooves sank to the fetlock. Horses stalled before they could reach the enemy line. The Mongol infantry, fighting on foot, used the treacherous ground to their advantage. They anchored their shield walls deep in the sand, creating an immovable barricade. Every cavalry charge hit the wall and disintegrated. Riders were catapulted from their saddles into the shallow water. Men drowned in inches of surf, trapped beneath the suffocating weight of their own dead horses, their heavy armor dragging them into the sand as the tide crept in around their faces. Behind the shield wall, the archers formed their ranks. They elevated their bows toward the sky. They released coordinated volleys of poisoned arrows in precise, overlapping arcs. The sky rained steel. The Japanese line began to crack apart. Commanders screamed themselves hoarse, but there was no unified command structure to hold anything together. Individual clans fought their own disconnected skirmishes, blind to the units collapsing to their left and right. The Mongols identified every gap and drove into it with surgical discipline. They advanced as an unbroken wall of spear points and detonating iron shells. The explosive bombs landed in the pine groves behind the beach, igniting the ancient trees. Smoke swallowed the defenders. Shock waves shattered what remained of their formation. They were forced to abandon the sand and retreat into the burning tree line. The retreat became a collapse. The samurai fled through the coastal forest, leaving their dead half buried in the tide. The Mongol advance did not accelerate into a chaotic pursuit. They moved forward in disciplined ranks, maintaining formation, clearing ground with methodical patience. They reached the town of Hakata. They set the merchant quarter ablaze. Flames jumped from rooftop to rooftop, casting an artificial orange daylight across the darkening sky. At the edge of the bay stood the Hakozaki Shrine, one of the most venerated sacred sites in the region. A sprawling compound of crimson gates, towering cedar columns, and layered thatch roofs dedicated to Hachiman, the patron deity of warriors. The samurai held an absolute belief that this ground was untouchable. They believed the divine spirits inhabiting the shrine would destroy any man who violated its sanctity. The Mongol officers did not worship Hachiman. They saw a large wooden complex providing cover to retreating enemy forces. They sent their engineers forward. Torches sailed onto the dry thatch. Black powder charges rolled across the sacred courtyards. The shrine detonated into a column of fire that could be seen from the hills miles away. The surviving defenders watched from the ridgeline above. They watched the house of their war god dissolve into gray ash. No divine lightning fell from the heavens. No sacred wind scattered the invaders. The theology that had sustained the warrior class for centuries was incinerating before their eyes, and nothing intervened to stop it. The gods were absent. The enemy was real, and the enemy was winning. While the western coastline burned, the political heart of Japan remained sealed inside a cocoon of ceremonial paralysis. In the imperial capital of Kyoto, hundreds of miles from the smell of black powder, the emperor and his court did not mount horses or march toward the front line. They gathered in their layered silk robes and performed elaborate purification rites. They composed seasonal poetry. They ordered monks to chant ancient sutras in the temple halls, believing that the vibration of sacred syllables could somehow materialize a physical wall against Mongol spears. They treated the invasion not as a military emergency, but as a spiritual examination. This chasm between the periphery that was bleeding and the center that was praying meant that the men dying on the beaches of Hakata were completely alone. No imperial reinforcements were on the march. No strategic reserves waited in the hills. The samurai of Kyushu were the last barrier standing between the Mongol war machine and the total disintegration of the nation. If they broke, Japan ceased to exist. Before we descend into the darkness of the night that followed, we need to talk about what keeps this channel alive. The stories we investigate here do not survive by accident. They survive because a committed group of people refuse to let them disappear into the sanitized noise of the algorithm. I want to invite you to join The Lineage, our channel membership. This is not a donation button. This is an invitation to step off the sidelines and stand with us. By joining The Lineage, you guarantee that these documentaries stay raw, uncompromising, and forensically detailed. You are not passively consuming history. You are becoming part of the team that keeps these investigations funded and fearless. You get exclusive early access to every piece of history we uncover, and you secure your seat in the inner circle. If you belong here, if you demand history with nothing filtered out, join the ranks today. The Japanese forces dug into the hills above Hakata Bay had reached the absolute limit of everything they had been taught. Honor was a corpse on the beach. The code of Bushido had revealed itself as a suicide contract against an enemy that operated on industrial logic. The killing continued until the last light bled from the sky. The samurai crouched in the darkness, listening to the wounded screaming from the burning ruins below. If they waited for sunrise, they would be ground to nothing by a force that outnumbered and outclassed them in every measurable dimension. They understood now, with the clarity that only catastrophic failure can deliver, that fighting within the rules meant dying. So as the embers of the Hakozaki shrine glowed in the black night, the surviving warriors began pulling off their heavy armor. They abandoned their family names. They set down their ceremonial longbows. They wrapped their fists around their short blades and stared down at the sprawling Mongol fleet resting in the dark bay below. They were about to shatter every sacred principle they had ever been raised to believe. The morning after the Hakozaki shrine was reduced to cinders, the sun climbed over a landscape that no longer resembled Japan. The surviving samurai stood on the blackened ridgeline above Hakata Bay, gripping weapons still dark with dried blood. They braced for the sight of the Mongol armada massing for the killing blow, the final amphibious push that would finish what the previous day had started. They looked out across the water. The bay was empty. Every ship was gone. Sometime during the night, an autumn squall had swept through the Tsushima Strait. It was not a miracle. It was not the hand of heaven reaching down to shield the chosen people. It was a routine low-pressure system. The the kind that rolls through every October without anyone writing a poem about it. The flat-bottomed Korean transports, assembled in haste from wood that had never been properly seasoned, buckled and split in the rough chop. The Mongol commanders, calculating the risk of losing their entire fleet against the rocky coastline, ordered an immediate retreat. They severed their anchor chains. They turned their battered ships back toward the continent, abandoning a few hundred drowned conscripts whose bodies washed ashore with the morning tide. The Japanese did not cheer. They walked in silence down to the waterline. They stepped over the dismembered carcasses of their war horses and the arrow-studded remains of men they had trained beside since childhood. They moved through the ashes of their sacred temples. The truth of AD 1274 settled into the collective marrow of the Kamakura shogunate, with the weight of a stone dropped into still water. They had not defeated the invasion. They had survived a reconnaissance mission, a preliminary test, and they understood with absolute certainty that the apex predator across the strait would return. When he did, he would not send 20,000 soldiers. He would send the end of the world. The boy regent Hojo Tokimune buried the fantasy of honorable warfare in the same ashes that covered the Hakozaki shrine. The shogunate stopped chanting prayers to Hachiman and started quarrying stone. In the spring of AD 1275, Tokumun issued an edict that conscripted the labor force of every coastal province in southern Japan. He commanded the construction of the Genko Borui, a continuous stone fortification stretching 20 kilometers along the exact curvature of Hakata Bay. For 5 years, the rigid social architecture of Japan collapsed into the mud of the building sites. High-born samurai, men who would have drawn steel over a perceived insult at a tea ceremony, worked side by side with illiterate rice farmers. They hauled raw granite from inland quarries on wooden sledges. They dragged the massive blocks using braided ropes of hemp and human hair. They stacked the stones without mortar, angling the ocean-facing surface into a steep incline that offered no grip to a climbing soldier. The wall rose 2 meters above the sand. It was an architectural confession of total defeat. By erecting this barrier, the warrior class of the Kamakura period formally admitted that their ancestral blades and their culture of individual glory were worthless against the industrialized machinery of Mongol warfare. The age of the duel was over. The age of the wall had begun. Kublai Khan did not spend those years in contemplation. He was enraged. The tactical withdrawal of his fleet was a minor inconvenience, but the continued defiance of a small island chain was a stain on his personal authority. In AD 1275, he dispatched a final delegation of 5 senior envoys to Japan. They landed on the southern coast at Nagato province. They carried a parchment stamped with the golden seal of the Khan. The document contained no offer of negotiation. It demanded that the Japanese emperor travel personally to Beijing, lower himself to the marble floor of the Mongol court, and formally surrender every claim to sovereignty. Tokimun received the report in Kamakura. He did not grant the envoys an audience. He ordered the 5 diplomats shackled and marched across the country to the execution grounds at Tatsunokuchi. The lead envoy, a scholar named Tu Shizhong, knelt in the damp sand. He did not plead. He asked for a writing brush and a fragment of paper. He composed a final poem about the sound of waves meeting the shore. The executioner stepped forward. A single stroke severed the vertebrae at the base of the skull. The heads of all 5 men were mounted on wooden stakes along the main highway. Tokimun had incinerated the last remaining thread of diplomacy. He had guaranteed a war that would accept no outcome short of total destruction. Across the sea, the geopolitical map shattered and reformed. By AD 1279, Kublai Khan accomplished what no conqueror before him had managed. His armies drove south, and annihilated the last holdouts of the Song dynasty at the naval battle of Yamen. The Mongol Empire now held the entirety of China in its grip. The Khan absorbed the staggering agricultural output, the advanced metalworking capability, and the complete naval infrastructure of the conquered Chinese state. He turned his gaze eastward once more. He ordered the assembly of the largest seaborne invasion force in the history of civilization, a military mobilization that would not be matched in scale until the Allied landings of the Second World War. He designed the assault as a two-pronged trap. The Eastern Route Army consisted of 40,000 battle-tested Mongol, Korean, and Jurchen veterans. They launched from the harbors of the Korean peninsula. The Southern Route Army was a colossal formation of 100,000 recently subjugated Chinese soldiers. They launched from the mouth of the Yangtze River. 140,000 men, 4,500 ships. The supply chain required to keep this mass of humanity fed and armed exceeded every logistical model the 13th century possessed. The cargo holds were stacked with barrels of fermented mare's milk, slabs of dried meat, and thousands of disassembled siege engines. They sailed to eclipse the horizon. June, AD 1281. The Eastern Route Army reached Japanese waters first. They bypassed the devastated islands of Tsushima and Iki without stopping. They sailed directly into Hakata Bay. The Mongol commanders stood on the elevated decks of their command ships, fully expecting to find the same undefended shoreline and the same disorganized samurai they had torn apart 7 years earlier. What they found instead was a continuous barrier of gray granite stretching unbroken across the entire coastline. The assault barges separated from the fleet. Thousands of infantrymen splashed into the surf. They waded toward the beach, holding their wicker shields above their heads against the expected arrow fire. They reached the sand. They hit the Genko Borui. The angled stone face offered nothing to grip. Men weighed down by leather armor and iron weapons clawed at the smooth granite and slid back into the wet sand. The Mongol cavalry, the foundational weapon of their tactical supremacy, was rendered completely useless. A war horse cannot climb a vertical wall. The mounted units milled in confusion between the crashing waves at their backs and the impassable stone ahead of them. The Japanese longbowmen rose to the top of the parapet. For the first time in this war, they occupied a fixed defensive position with clear lines of fire. They aimed down into the dense mass of invaders compressed against the base of the wall. They released a sustained, rolling barrage of steel-tipped arrows. Shafts punched through the wicker shields. They drove men into the sand and pinned them there. The Mongol troops attempted to deploy their explosive shells, but the steep angle of the fortification caused the iron spheres to bounce and roll backward into the ranks of the attackers before the fuses burned down. Shrapnel detonated among their own assault troops. The shallow water at the base of the wall turned a deep, opaque red. The commanders sounded the withdrawal horns. The surviving infantry scrambled back onto their landing boats. They rowed for deep water. They dropped anchor. They decided to hold position and wait for the massive southern fleet to arrive before attempting another assault. They waited. The month of July descended on the Tsushima Strait like a furnace lid slamming shut. The Japanese summer is not ordinary heat. It is a saturating, airless humidity that presses against the skin and accelerates the decay of everything organic. 40,000 men sat confined on the open timber decks of the Eastern Fleet. The shallow bay water reflected solar radiation directly onto the hulls. The wood baked. The pitch caulking between the planks softened and began to run in black streaks down the sides of the ships. The biological consequences of this stagnation became a killing force more efficient than any weapon the Mongols carried. The fleet shared a limited supply of drinking water stored in sealed wooden casks. In the relentless heat, the still water became an incubator. Dysentery struck first. Cholera followed. The diseases swept through the lower decks like an invisible wildfire. The progression was vicious. A soldier would feel a dull cramp in his gut at sunrise. By midday, his body would be violently purging every fluid it contained. His skin would take on a gray, bluish pallor as the blood retreated from his extremities. His muscles would seize in excruciating spasms. He would die curled on the warped floorboards, his body a desiccated shell. The death rate climbed by the hour. The ships became floating morgues. The officers issued emergency sanitation protocols to prevent the complete biological collapse of the army. They ordered the healthy soldiers to haul the dead from below deck and throw them into the bay. But Hakata Bay is a semi-enclosed body of water. The tides did not flush the corpses out to open sea. The currents pushed the swollen, gas-filled bodies back against the hulls of the ships. Hundreds of decomposing men floated in the warm water, bumping against the wooden planks with every passing swell. The bay became a stagnant pool of human putrefaction. The stench of cholera and rot drifted across the surface of the water, climbed the stone wall, and settled into the lungs of the samurai waiting on the other side. The defenders watched the dying fleet from the top of the Genko Borui. They could see the Mongols were immobilized, trapped between the architecture they could not breach and the disease they could not stop. The samurai examined the ancient codes they had carried into every battle their fathers and grandfathers had fought. They examined the reality of the enemy rotting in the bay. They made a collective decision to abandon every principle that had defined them. They discarded the concept of the honorable duel. They shed their lacquered armor. They stripped down to simple loincloths in the suffocating heat. They rubbed their skin with a thick paste of wet ash and charcoal scraped from the campfires until they were indistinguishable from shadow. They dragged small, flat-bottomed fishing boats from hidden inlets behind the fortification wall. They coated the hulls in black pitch. They wrapped the oar shafts in tightly wound straw to eliminate the sound of wood breaking water. They became something the Mongol Empire had never encountered. They became invisible. When the sun dropped below the horizon and the bay dissolved into the absolute darkness of a moonless night, the killing began. 10 men climbed into each boat. They carried nothing but their short blades, the wakizashi and the tanto. They did not light a single flame. They rowed into the black water, steering only by the faint outlines of the towering Mongol warships against the marginally lighter sky. They threaded their way through a floating field of bloated, decomposing corpses. The smell was a physical wall of decay that filled the mouth and coated the throat. They reached the flank of a massive enemy vessel. The hull rose above them like a cliff face of dark timber. They did not call out. They did not announce themselves. They produced iron grappling hooks wrapped in dense hemp padding to muffle the impact. They lobbed them over the high rails. They hauled themselves up the ropes hand over hand, bare feet pressing silently against the rough wood. They crested the gunwale and rolled onto the main deck. The Mongol sentries were depleted. Half of them were sick. Their eyes were fixed on the shoreline, scanning for the glow of a massed frontal attack. None of them looked down at the water. The ash-blackened figures moved across the deck without a sound. A samurai approached a guard from behind. One hand sealed the man's mouth. The short blade drove upward beneath the ribs and punctured the heart. The sentry folded without making a noise. The body was dragged into the darkness between stacked cargo. The raiding parties advanced toward the sleeping quarters below deck. They found soldiers too weak from cholera to lift a weapon. There was no hesitation. The short blades rose and fell in the darkness. They opened the throats of sleeping men with precise horizontal cuts across the carotid artery. Arterial blood sprayed across the timber walls in pressurized arcs. They severed the heads of the ranking officers and knotted them to their own belts by the hair. They scattered oil-soaked rags through the lower holds. They tossed a single burning ember into the dark. The stored black powder reserves caught. A detonation ripped the deck apart from below. The samurai hurled themselves over the rails, dropping into the freezing black water of the bay as the ship erupted behind them. They swam back to their hidden boats. They rowed for shore. Behind them, a warship burned to the waterline, and the survivors aboard the neighboring vessels screamed into the darkness at an enemy they could not see. These raids did not happen once. They happened every single night for weeks, without interruption. The Mongol army could not sleep. They could not recover. They could not close their eyes without the terror that an ash-covered phantom was already standing over them with a blade. The psychological disintegration was total. To understand the precise mechanics of these nocturnal assaults at the level of individual ship corridors and body counts, you have to go to the primary source material. The specific volume documenting the architectural layout of the Mongol galleons and the forensic casualty records of the ash-covered samurai is on your screen right now. Click the View Products button. This book is a comprehensive archive of organized violence. It strips away the legend and presents the clinical reality of the AD 1281 slaughter in granular detail. You need this volume to grasp the full depth of what happened in that bay. While you are there, browse the collection. We have assembled a curated selection of rare, era-specific artifacts and themed relics tied directly to this period. Discover what other pieces of dark history are waiting to complete your shelf. Open the shop. Secure the artifacts. We return to the bay. August, AD 1281. The stagnant purgatory of Hakata Bay was shattered by a sound rolling in from the south. The defenders standing on the Genko Borui turned their gaze toward Imari Bay. The ocean turned black. The Southern Route Army had arrived. 100,000 fresh Chinese soldiers sailed into the strait aboard a fleet so vast it filled the visible horizon from edge to edge. The two enormous armadas converged. 4,500 ships packed the bay until no open water remained visible between the hulls. The density of timber was staggering, a floating continent of wood and iron. The Mongol commanders, exhausted by weeks of nocturnal slaughter and rampant disease, executed a dramatic tactical decision. They ordered the ships to pull alongside one another. They linked the hulls together with massive iron chains. They laid heavy timber planks across the gaps between the vessels. They converted a mobile fleet into a single continuous floating fortress that stretched for miles across the surface of the bay. They erected elevated catapult platforms on the interconnected decks. They loaded the counterweight mechanisms with heavy stone projectiles and incendiary ceramic vessels filled with black powder and burning oil. They aligned the siege engines toward the shore. The defenders behind the Genko Borui stood in exhausted silence. They had been fighting off amphibious probes, disease, starvation, and sleep deprivation for 2 consecutive months. Their hands were raw and split. Their arrow reserves were nearly gone. They stared at the floating city of timber and chain and understood the mathematics with perfect terminal clarity. The Kamakura shogunate had mobilized every available fighting man in the southern provinces. There were no reinforcements hidden in the forests. There was no secret army marching south from Kyoto. This was the final position. There was nothing behind them. The sun began its descent on the evening of August 14th. The Mongol war drums resumed their deep, grinding rhythm. The bass vibration rolled across the water and shook loose dirt from the cracks in the stone wall. The bronze gongs crashed in metallic waves. The fleet commanders finalized the assault orders for dawn. When the first light broke over the eastern horizon the following morning, 140,000 men would launch a coordinated, overwhelming amphibious assault on every meter of the fortification simultaneously. They would breach the wall, they would flood across the island, they would erase Japan from the political map of the world. The defenders wrapped their bleeding hands around the grips of their swords and stared into the darkness. They did not expect to see another sunset. The air above Hakata Bay went completely still. It is the evening of August 14th, AD 1281. The Japanese defenders stood along the top of their 20-kilometer stone wall and felt the sweat collecting in pools beneath their chest plates. The humidity climbed to total saturation. The cicadas in the ancient pine groves behind the fortification fell silent in unison, as if something had reached into the forest and pressed a hand over every living mouth. The barometric pressure began to drop, producing a deep, throbbing ache behind the temples of every man on the shoreline. They looked out at the water. The combined Mongol armada, a floating city of 4,500 ships, sat motionless on the glassy surface. The commanders of the Khan had committed to one final, irreversible tactical decision: to neutralize the ash-covered samurai who had been boarding their ships in the dark and butchering their crews. They had welded the entire fleet into a single structure. They ran heavy iron chains from hull to hull. They bolted thick timber planking across the gaps. They engineered a continuous, unbroken platform of wood and metal that stretched from one edge of the visible horizon to the other. They believed this interconnected fortress made them impervious to the small raiding parties. They were correct. But the enemy they had fortified against was no longer human. The enemy, gathering strength in the atmosphere above them, obeyed no flag, answered no signal horn, and could not be stopped by any chain ever forged. The sky did not darken in the way a normal evening darkens. It turned a nauseating, mottled shade of purple and green, the color of deep bruising on living tissue. This is the atmospheric signature of a severe low-pressure system forming over the superheated waters of the Philippine Sea. For days, the thermal energy of the ocean had been feeding a deepening vortex of rising air. The rotation of the Earth torqued the ascending column into a tight, accelerating spiral. A typhoon was tracking up the Tsushima Strait, directly toward the mouth of Hakata Bay. The Mongol commanders were conquerors of dry land. Their entire doctrine had been written on the flat, wind-swept steppes of Central Asia. They understood cavalry maneuvers, siege mathematics, and infantry coordination at a level no other civilization on Earth could match. They did not understand the terminal physics of a Western Pacific hurricane. They looked at the green sky and dismissed it as a passing summer storm. They left their anchors in the seabed. They left their iron chains locked. They went to sleep. The wind struck the bay 2 hours past midnight. It did not arrive as a gradual escalation. It arrived as a solid, physical wall of compressed air, moving at a velocity that modern instruments would classify at over 150 miles per hour. The acoustic reality of a storm at this magnitude is beyond description. The roar of the wind erases every other sound. You cannot hear the man screaming directly into your ear. The defenders behind the Genko Borui threw themselves flat into the mud and dug their fingers into the earth to keep their bodies from being ripped off the ground. The ocean, confined within the basin of the bay, with no room to dissipate the energy, began to stack. A storm surge built rapidly. A wall of black water rose 10 feet above the normal high tide mark and drove itself into the anchored fleet with the full momentum of the open Pacific behind it. The Mongol defensive strategy instantly became the instrument of their annihilation. The flat-bottom transports, constructed in haste by Korean forced labor using timber that had never been properly cured, possessed almost no structural flexibility. When the enormous ocean swell lifted the outermost vessels of the chained formation, the iron links snapped rigid. The tensile strength of the chains exceeded the structural integrity of the wooden hulls they were bolted to. The links ripped the mooring hardware directly out of the decks, tearing open massive breaches in the sides of the neighboring ships. The vessels could not rise and fall with the waves independently. When a single massive warship rolled under the wind shear and capsized, the chains dragged the 5 ships connected to it below the surface. It was a mechanical cascade of destruction on a scale no one aboard could have imagined. 1 ship killed 6. 6 killed 30. The entire chained formation began to collapse inward on itself, like a structure made of dry sticks. Below the waterline, the horror was absolute. 140,000 men were trapped in the dark holds of a disintegrating fleet. The wooden planks buckled under the torsional stress of the waves, twisting the hulls in opposite directions. Seawater exploded through the splitting seams under enormous pressure. The oil lanterns shattered on impact, plunging the lower decks into total blackness. Men clawed their way toward the narrow wooden ladders, bottlenecking at the hatches in a suffocating crush of bodies. The soldiers wore thick boiled leather and iron lamellar plates. The moment the seawater reached them, the armor absorbed the weight and dragged them down. Thousands of war horses chained in the lowest transport holds panicked as the water rose around their legs. The animals thrashed in the blackness, their iron-shod hooves smashing the skulls and ribs of the soldiers trying to swim past them. The ocean poured through every crack. Lungs filled with salt water. The reflexive gasp for air pulled in nothing but sea. The fleet was being ground into fragments in an industrial-scale drowning that no act of courage or discipline could resist. The storm raged through the night and into the following day. It did not break until the pale, exhausted dawn of August 16th. The low-pressure system finally moved inland and collapsed against the mountain ranges of Kyushu. The surviving samurai peeled themselves out of the mud behind their fortification wall. They climbed to the parapets. They looked down at Hakata Bay. The floating city of wood and iron had ceased to exist. The water was a churning, opaque sludge of gray silt, pulverized timber, and human remains. The bay was choked from shore to shore with the dead. The bodies of Chinese conscripts, Korean laborers, and Mongol veterans rolled in the gentle surf, tangled in shredded sailcloth and snapped rigging lines. The waterline was stained dark red for as far as the eye could follow the curve of the coast. The smell of ozone left by the storm mixed with the immediate overwhelming stench of tens of thousands of waterlogged corpses already beginning to swell in the climbing summer heat. The sheer volume of the dead reshaped the physical geography of the shoreline. The samurai discovered they could walk hundreds of meters out into the shallow water without touching the seabed, stepping only on the compressed layer of floating wreckage and the backs of drowned men. But the ocean did not swallow everyone. The tidal currents inside the bay funneled the debris toward a single geographical choke point, Taka Island, a small, jagged landmass of volcanic rock sitting at the mouth of the bay. Thousands of men who had managed to cling to shattered masts, broken doors, and fragments of hull planking washed up on the sharp rocks of Taka Island. They dragged themselves onto the narrow beach. They were coughing seawater. They were trembling in the humid air. They had lost their weapons, their armor, their commanders, and any coherent chain of command. They were stranded on a barren rock with no source of fresh water and no food. Within hours, the desperate survivors were slicing open the carcasses of drowned war horses that washed up beside them and drinking the blood pooling in the body cavities. They sat in the sand and stared at the horizon, waiting for rescue ships to appear. The rescue ships never came. The samurai did. The Kamakura shogunate did not classify these survivors as prisoners of war entitled to any form of quarter. They classified them as a remaining threat to be neutralized. The samurai dragged their black-painted fishing boats back into the water. They rowed for Taka Island. They did not sound horns. They did not announce their lineage. The era of martial theater had been dead for weeks. They landed on the rocky shore and drew their short blades. What followed was not combat. It was organized, systematic execution. The samurai moved down the beach, kicking the exhausted, dehydrated survivors face down into the sand. They forced them into long, kneeling rows at the waterline. They walked behind the line, raising their blades and bringing them down through the cervical vertebrae of one man after another. The physical mechanics of mass decapitation are brutally exhausting. Human vertebral bone is dense. The cutting edge of a carbon steel katana chips, rolls, and deforms after striking through a dozen spinal columns. The blades became dull iron bars within minutes. The samurai discarded ruined weapons and picked up fresh ones from the growing piles of the dead. They rotated executioners in shifts when the muscles of the forearm and shoulder seized from the repeated impact. The sand of Taka Island became a deep, saturated red paste. Men waiting in the line slipped and fell in the coagulating blood of the soldiers who had knelt in the same spot moments before them. The shogunate commanders observed the process from canvas shelters erected on the higher ground of the beach. They directed the operation with administrative precision. The killing was not indiscriminate. They implemented a triage system based on economic utility. Interrogators walked through the rows of shivering, salt-crusted men. They identified Song Chinese artisans, carpenters, metal workers, and shipwrights. If a man possessed a technical skill that could serve the Japanese economy, he was extracted from the line and designated for enslavement. If a man was Korean, he was forced back to his knees. If a man was identified as an ethnic Mongol, a soldier of the Khan's elite, he was subjected to immediate and deliberate execution. The veteran cavalry of the empire were butchered in the sand with no more ceremony than the slaughter of livestock. The executioners severed the left ear from each corpse and tossed them into wooden counting barrels for the official death tally. The purge continued for days without interruption. By the time the last boat rowed back to the mainland, Taka Island was a silent field of headless bodies baking in the sun. The Mongol threat to Japan was permanently erased from the physical world. This is the precise fracture point in the history of Japan. This is the moment where a meteorological accident was seized, distorted, and hammered into a national delusion that would echo for 700 years. Hundreds of miles from the stench of the rotting bay, the emperor and his court sat in the immaculate palaces of Kyoto. They had not drawn a single blade. They had not bled on any beach. They had spent the entire duration of the invasion performing purification rituals, composing seasonal verse, and ordering monks to chant sutras in candlelit halls. When the riders arrived bearing news of the typhoon and the annihilation of the fleet, the religious establishment recognized an unprecedented opportunity to consolidate power. They could claim ownership of the victory. The temples and shrines launched a coordinated propaganda campaign on a scale Japan had never seen. They drafted official proclamations declaring that the typhoon was not a weather event. It was a direct, deliberate act of the gods, summoned into existence by the sacred prayers of the emperor. They gave the storm a name that would outlive every man who fought in the bay. They called it the Kamikaze, the divine wind. The samurai who had actually bled on the sand, who had crawled through floating corpses to board enemy ships in the dark, who had sawed through the necks of men on Taka Island until their arms went numb, they knew the truth. They knew they survived because the Korean transports were built with green wood that could not withstand open water. They knew they survived because the Mongol commanders chained their own fleet into a single fragile structure. They knew they survived by accident. But the men on the beaches did not control the narrative. The priests in Kyoto controlled the narrative. Over the following decades, the desperate, bloody, chaotic reality of the Hakata Bay killing ground was methodically scrubbed from the cultural record and replaced with a clean theological story. Japan was the land of the gods. The Japanese archipelago was sacred, inviolable territory. The divine spirits would always rise to annihilate any foreign power that dared approach by sea. This lie calcified into the foundational bedrock of the Japanese national identity. It was taught to every generation of children. It was recited in every temple. It was treated as historical fact by the government. The shogunate sealed the nation's borders and enforced centuries of deliberate isolation, secure in the conviction that they existed behind an invisible wall of divine protection. They incubated a toxic certainty. They came to believe they were biologically and spiritually superior to every other civilization on the planet, shielded by a force that no foreign army could overcome. Fast forward 700 years. The echo of that lie traveled intact through the centuries and detonated in the 20th. It is AD 1944. The Japanese Empire had expanded across the Pacific Basin, propelled by the identical arrogance that had crystallized in the aftermath of the Mongol invasions. But the empire was disintegrating. The American war machine, a genuine industrialized apex predator operating on a scale the world had never seen, was tightening a perimeter of steel and fire around the home islands. The Imperial Japanese Navy was functionally destroyed. Control of the air was lost. The mathematics of the conflict pointed to a single, unavoidable conclusion: total defeat. The military high command, staring into the abyss of unconditional annihilation, reached 7 centuries into the past. They resurrected the myth of the Hakata Bay storm. They told their starving, firebombed population that the gods would intervene again. The people simply needed to demonstrate the depth of their devotion. The command structure created the special attack units. They selected thousands of young men, teenagers who had received only the most rudimentary flight training, and strapped them into the cockpits of Mitsubishi Zero fighters. They packed the fuselages with high explosives. They loaded the fuel tanks with just enough aviation gasoline for a one-way flight. They poured each boy a ceremonial cup of sake. They placed a white headband across each forehead. They told them they were the new Kamikaze. They were the new divine wind. Their deaths would summon the gods. The pilots took off from island airstrips across the shrinking perimeter. They flew low over the water toward the American carrier battle groups. They did not expect to return. They believed with absolute sincerity that their sacrifice would trigger the same divine intervention that had destroyed the Mongol fleet. They believed that the moment their aircraft struck the steel decks of the enemy ships, the gods would awaken from their long silence and send a typhoon to consume the American armada, just as the storm had consumed the fleet of the Khan. The young men died in spiraling fireballs over the open Pacific. They burned alive inside their cockpits. They disintegrated against the concentrated fire of anti-aircraft batteries. They died waiting for a storm that was never coming. Nature was indifferent in AD 1281, and it was indifferent in AD 1944. There were no gods stationed above the archipelago. The theology was a fabrication built on the bones of men who had died in a bay 7 centuries earlier. The Americans did not chain their ships together. They did not anchor in a confined bay. They did not wait. They advanced. The delusion held its grip until the final hour. The Japanese government refused to accept surrender, clinging to a 700-year-old conviction that the sacred soil of the home islands could not be conquered. They forced the hand of an entirely new branch of physics. On August 6th, AD 1945, the sky above Hiroshima did not turn the bruised green of an approaching typhoon. It turned a white so absolute, it burned the shadows of human beings into concrete walls. A single B-29 bomber released a weapon that replicated the core of a collapsing star. The atomic flash vaporized the center of the city in a fraction of a second. 3 days later, a second detonation erased Nagasaki. The nuclear fire did not merely destroy 2 cities. It incinerated the kamikaze myth at the molecular level. It burned away the arrogance, the theology, and the 700-year-old lie that had been born on the blood-soaked sand of Tsushima and nurtured in the silent temples of Kyoto. The Mongols did not conquer Japan in the 13th century, but the delusion that grew from surviving them carried the nation, step by blind step, to the absolute threshold of total annihilation. Thank you for walking through the dark with us to the very end. Take a moment to subscribe to the channel, leave a like on this video, and share this story with someone who needs to understand the real weight of history. You have just watched another premium documentary from Ancestral, your ultimate history hub on YouTube. Do not stop here. The descent continues. Click the video appearing on your screen right now. Watch it immediately and continue your journey into the darkest archives of the human past.